Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're looking at something really profound, something that touches literally millions of lives, but honestly, it often goes completely misunderstood. We usually think of poverty on a strictly individual level, like a personal hurdle to overcome. But today, we're diagnosing a deeply rooted national issue, structural poverty in Indonesia. Okay, let's dive right in. We really need to ask a hard question right off the bat. Is poverty really just about being lazy? It's a super common misconception, right? There's this pervasive idea out there that if you just work harder, you're naturally going to get ahead. But, when we actually look at the data and the deep-seated realities on the ground, we quickly realize we aren't just looking at a lack of individual effort here. We're dealing with a massive systemic condition.
When you map out the source material, you realize exactly what we're up against. Poverty here is definitely not a single, straight line. It's more like a massive, tangled web of causes, systemic failures, devastating impacts, and ultimately, necessary solutions. To make sense of this giant web, here is our roadmap. First, we'll cover what structural poverty actually is. Second, we'll dig into the roots of inequality. Third, we're looking at policy and infrastructure failures. Fourth, the real-world impacts on society. And finally, the way out and the solutions.
Okay, Section 1. What exactly is structural poverty? Let's look at the core diagnosis.
The core diagnosis here is something called multidimensional poverty. So this isn't just a matter of having an empty wallet today. It's poverty that is strictly structural in nature. It's driven by this deeply intertwined combination of economic, social, and even spatial factors. It's kind of like a heavy, invisible architecture that actively prevents people from fulfilling their most basic, everyday needs.
So, the absolutely crucial point to understand is that this condition doesn't just happen by accident. And it definitely doesn't cure itself. It's maintained. It is actively sustained by unequal development patterns. When long-term policies are ineffective, and when development continuously bypasses marginalized rural and coastal areas, structural poverty basically becomes locked in place. It becomes a permanent ceiling for the folks living there.
Moving on to Section 2, digging into the roots of inequality. Let's diagnose the pathogens.
When we look at the root causes outlined in the source, a pretty stark and objective contrast emerges. On one hand, we see marginalized groups facing systemic social injustice and discrimination, and this can be based on gender, ethnicity, geographic region, or caste. And then on the other hand, we see a highly unequal concentration of wealth and asset ownership. This is the structural reality of exactly how opportunity and resources are currently distributed.
And the disparity is massive. A very, very small fraction of the population holds highly concentrated wealth and key assets, leaving a huge gap for everyone else. Escaping poverty under these conditions, it isn't just about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Structurally, it requires major intervention.
So how does this massive disparity actually physically manifest in everyday life? Well, it shows up as severely limited access. Imagine trying to climb a ladder where the bottom 5 rungs are literally missing. We're looking at deeply unequal infrastructure between villages and cities. We're talking completely unreachable health services, massive gaps in education that inevitably lead to a skills mismatch in the job market, and physical barriers to basic human needs like sanitation and clean water. These access gaps literally stop social mobility in its tracks.
And because of these barriers, workers are pushed into corners. The source highlights a massive dependence on vulnerable economic sectors. Millions have to rely on volatile natural resources or they get swept into the informal economy. Why does this matter? Well, because operating in the informal sector means working completely without a safety net. There's no legal protection, no benefits, and severely restricted access to public services. One bad week can spell absolute disaster.
All right, Section 3, policy and infrastructure failures. Let's look at systemic implementation failures.
It isn't always a lack of ideas. Often, it's a failure in innovation and implementation. Just look at these roadblocks. We've got unsynchronized policies between the central and regional governments, social aid that is suboptimal and misses its target, an incredibly complicated bureaucracy just to get a simple permit. On top of that, there are inconsistent definitions of poverty itself. When a policy strictly focuses on daily income and ignores all those multidimensional, spatial factors we just talked about, the gaps in social protection just keep widening.
Then we really have to look at the money, the allocation of funds. The data points directly to low infrastructure investment in the regions that actually need it most, coupled with misdirected energy subsidies. And that is a devastating combo. When you have a low return on investment for public projects, or billions going to energy subsidies that miss the mark, you drain the critical funding needed for primary public services. The money that desperately needs to go to local health and education, it simply isn't there.
Which brings us to Section 4, the real impacts on society, the visible symptoms.
All of this fuels a vicious repeating cycle of poverty. Step 1, you start with poor health, low education, and malnutrition. If you start there, you inevitably drop right into Step 2, low productivity and hindered economic potential. You simply don't have the physical or educational tools to work at your best. And that leads directly to Step 3, low social mobility and a forced reliance on short-term aid just to survive. Tragically, because nothing's structurally changed, the cycle just starts all over again for the exact next generation.
But the symptoms don't stop at the individual level, right? They bleed out into the entire nation. And this is exactly why this matters to all of us. We see criminality rising directly from extreme economic pressure. We see deeper social injustice and marginalization. At a macro level, economic growth becomes severely fragmented, hurting everyone's bottom line and leading to even lower investment in those poor areas. Ultimately, as the source notes, this breeds deep social and political instability. When public trust erodes because basic structural needs aren't being met, the entire foundation of a society shakes.
So let's look at Section 5, the way out and solutions. What's the prescription here?
To treat this, the immediate remedies require immense inclusivity and really robust social programs. We need a massive push for scholarships and vocational training to finally fix that skills mismatch. We need broad, genuinely affordable safety nets. The prescription also clearly includes preventative health and mobile clinics to physically reach those isolated areas, alongside aggressive support and real market access for micro-businesses. We have to empower people with the tools to build their own economic engines.
But those social programs are gonna fail if they aren't paired with regional development reform. We absolutely cannot just focus our resources on the big cities. Development must be aggressively decentralized. We've got to prioritize basic, foundational infrastructure, things like clean water, reliable electricity, and broadband internet, directly in remote and rural areas. You literally have to level the playing field before you can ask people to play the game.
And to ensure these policies actually work, the final recommendation is the adoption of a spatial analysis framework and the integration of localized indicators. Now, I know that sounds super technical, but it's actually quite simple. It basically means using highly specific, localized geographic data to accurately pinpoint the most vulnerable areas. It means using consistent poverty indicators across every single government agency to monitor real progress. Because at the end of the day, you can't cure a disease if you aren't properly measuring the patient's vitals, right?
So, we have unpacked a massive, deeply rooted structure today. It's pretty clear that structural poverty isn't a lack of willpower. It's a lack of functional pathways. But looking at all these required solutions, from education to healthcare to infrastructure to massive bureaucratic reform, I want to leave you with this to think about. Which of these massive structural policies must be changed first to truly break this chain? What's the domino that will make the rest fall? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Remember, poverty isn't always a personal failure. Sometimes it's by design. Keep questioning the structures around you.